So good morning, everyone. You have reached the last presentation in our virtual conference series, which started in May with the vendor presentations and is concluding today. With June, we hosted all of the Galileo-related presentations, Galileo-specific related presentations. And I'm Joy Woodson. I'm an assistant director at Galileo in charge of marketing and communications. And today's presentation, the second one of today, will be on OpenAthens, what to expect for public libraries. They are about to be underway. I know some, I think maybe one branch is already in effect, and Russell will probably talk about that later. But for the presentation today, we have Amanda Ferrante. Hopefully I've pronounced your name correctly. Amanda is a product manager in the Authentication Solutions area of EBSCO. We also have Russell Palmer here today. I'm sure all of you guys know Russell. He's an assistant director at Galileo in charge of support services. And I will just hand it over to them. Thank you all for being here today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joy. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your attendance and your time today. It's a little late in the day on a beautiful Friday afternoon here in Massachusetts. So I'm sure, like me, you're all looking forward to the weekend. What we have for you today is a quick overview of OpenAthens for you in the public libraries belonging to the Galileo group. We wanted to really give a foundational understanding of what OpenAthens is and the main purpose of the service for libraries. But we also want to review the OpenAthens implementation process for you to really get into the nitty-gritty of what will change for your patrons, how their experience might change, and what might change for you as the administrators of your library resource access. And so we will do a step-by-step breakdown of the OpenAthens implementation process for Galileo public libraries. And then toward the end, we will have a little bit of a snapshot of OpenAthens usage reporting, what kind of data it can make available to those of you in the library who may want to have additional visibility into how much usage some of your resources are getting. We'll review some frequently asked questions, and you'll notice throughout these slides do tend to be a little wordy. They do tend to have links here and there. And the reason for that is simply because the slide deck will be made available to all of you along with the recording of this session following the recordings processing and so on and so forth. So we wanted to make the slide deck itself a resource for you as well. So I'll start just by kicking off with a brief overview of what the OpenAthens service is. OpenAthens is a single sign-on service, so its primary foundational aim is just to make it easier for your patrons to log into your electronic resources and content. It's sometimes referred to as an identity and access management tool, which really means that in terms of identity, the library, or in this case, Galileo, can set up whatever accounts to use for the single sign-on logins that are available. So we'll get into this a little bit more later on in the presentation, but for Galileo public libraries, users will be logging into the single sign-on service using their existing Evergreen accounts. In terms of access management, that means that OpenAthens has the ability to say who can access what. So if you're a library who grants permission to a particular resource just for perhaps library staff versus the entire corpus of your patrons, you will have the ability to control who is accessing what. It is built on a technology called SAML, and for the purposes of the OpenAthens implementation, there really isn't too much of a reason to do a deep dive into what SAML is, but suffice to say that it is considered to be an industry standard in secure authentication. So it can support a login to a vendor's resource or a database, and it also can support something called automatic personalization, where in some cases, for example, if I'm logging into EBSCO using OpenAthens, I not only get logged in as a member of my library, but I can also get straight into my EBSCO folder. So SAML, in a lot of cases, can make the login experience more efficient for the user by logging them directly into their personal folder. And finally, OpenAthens is fully cloud-based, which simply means that there's no requirement for Galileo or individual libraries to install new updates, do any maintenance on the software itself. All right. Much of the time when we're talking about what OpenAthens is, it's easiest actually just to talk about what will change for your end users and for you as the administrators of your access. So we'll start with the end users. The first thing that will happen for the end user's experience is, in most cases, we hope, it will be easier to log in. Your library patrons, in many cases, are using their Evergreen login or their barcode, I expect, to maybe get into your library catalog, sign into the machines in your physical location, and so on. If that's the only account they need to log into the single sign-on service, then we're not requiring them to remember a different account or even a specific account for each service provider's platform. OpenAthens is also fully web-based, which means that it can be used not just within the library, but anywhere and on any device. So essentially, we're offering an authentication service that people can use wherever they're actually conducting their research, from home, on their device, and so on. The first time somebody logs into OpenAthens, what they'll see is actually the Evergreen login screen that they're already accustomed to using. So in the same vein of not requiring your end users to remember multiple accounts for different logins, we're also not presenting them with a brand new login screen necessarily. They're going to see the login screen, same login screen every time they come back to single sign-on service. And finally, we do find that this is impactful to end users, though it's not necessarily always visible to your patrons. But the fact that OpenAthens can provide some pretty granular usage reporting means that you in the library could potentially have a little bit more visibility into the resources that your patrons are going to, maybe what they gravitate toward for one reason or another. So subscriptions renewals can be informed by that kind of data. Now, this is one of those slides that is going to look really wordy, have lots of links on it. This, if you are talking to anybody in your library about what to expect, perhaps anybody who wasn't able to attend today, these are little screenshots and screencasts that you can use to actually demo what it looks like to log in as a patron using OpenAthens. But for the purposes of our presentation today, I'll actually just open my browser and show you what it looks like here during our session. So this is the library website for Oak Park Public Library. They belong to the SWAN Consortium in Illinois. SWAN have been using OpenAthens for quite some time. And I liked using an actual public library website because I think this will probably look pretty familiar to many of you. So as an end user, I might try to find some electronic resources that I can do my research with. So I'll go ahead, and this is my first click of my browser session. So when I click on this link, it's actually going to prompt me for my OpenAthens login. Now, SWAN, similar to Galileo public libraries, store all of their user accounts and barcodes in their ILS. They use a Circe Dynix application. And so what I'm actually going to log into with here is my library card barcode. Now, the beauty of single sign-on, obviously, is not just that my single login got me into EBSCO and I can start accessing full text here, but when I go back to the library website, I can actually start to click on other things and start to do research in other places. So I'll go and find a newspaper. And I'll just go ahead and let's go to ProQuest. I've logged in once with OpenAthens, so I already have a session started. So clicking on a link to a different resource simply means that my session is acknowledged and the OpenAthens service passes me through to ProQuest. You can see here, ProQuest recognizes me as a member of my library, and I'll have access to whatever full text my library subscribes to. And that's one user experience. But we know, obviously, end users don't always begin at the library webpage, where you can sort of control their experience, prompt for their authentication whenever you feel it's most appropriate. We know that many users actually start their research out on the open web. So being that OpenAthens is a SAML-based service, it actually offers a backdoor to that full text content in many cases. If I go ahead and I just search for ProQuest. I remember last time I was in the library, I searched in ProQuest. I like some of the full text results I got there. And so I want to go back. I'll go ahead, click on the first result for ProQuest in here, and I'll perform a search. Now, many times, if you use something like IP access in your library, this would be the point at which the user hits a paywall and potentially is unable to find out how to get access to that full text. But SAML-based services, single sign-on, are usually serviceable through, I call it a backdoor. It's also sometimes called a find your organization. Essentially, I can search for my library. And when I select my library, it will route me through my OpenAthens. So this is a huge benefit if you're a library who's supporting patrons who are starting their research in a bunch of different places and frequently starting their research out on the open web. So again, I found a way in through that back door. I can be recognized as a member of my library and go ahead and start my research. So that was the 25-cent tour of what it looks like to log in as an end user using OpenAthens. But if you're interested to see other types of end user experiences, I would encourage you to check out these screenshots when these slides become available. Now that we've talked about what will change for patrons, we can talk a little bit more about what will change for you as administrators in your libraries. Now, some of this may be true, and Russell, I will rely on you to make sure that I'm giving the proper context here for our public libraries. Essentially, OpenAthens will broaden the ability for users to go out on the open web and successfully log in, as you just saw with ProQuest. But it, in some ways, will make the experience easier for administrators too. Many libraries that we work with rely very heavily on IP access, which, as we all know, is reliant in many cases on the physical location, or if you use a proxy service, isn't necessarily always the most secure authentication method. OpenAthens will actually defer to SAML access as much as possible, so that very secure industry standard, and has a built-in proxy IP to support any publishers who can't use SAML access yet. And for administrators, the beauty of that is that it's all in a single dashboard. So we're no longer going to different places to manage authentication with different tools, proxy service, other single sign-on, and so on. It's all in a single dashboard. And that dashboard will be managed centrally by the Galileo group and Russell's team for all of the public libraries. Beyond that, I heard somebody unmute. Russell, did you want to chime in there?
No, I was just going to say that for a lot of our public libraries, a lot of the authentication settings and proxy setup already happens behind the scene, and that can continue. Once we move to OpenAthens, we'll just need to engage our libraries in the actual setup for the first time. But we can also, and Amanda does a lot of this, we routinely offer training, and we expect that we'll have probably one person at each library system who is trained to manage the OpenAthens side of things as an administrator to be able to do some of this functionality as needed. But certainly you don't have to worry about if you aren't setting up your Galileo resources or your locally managed resources now, and you rely on Galileo to do that, you can continue to rely on Galileo to do that for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the context. So OpenAthens does also aim to put additional controls at the library's fingertips. Most authentication services aren't necessarily designed specifically for libraries, but that's not true about OpenAthens. Based on our experience with libraries using authentication, there are some enhancements and features in the service that are meant to fulfill specific needs that we hear of from libraries. So for example, if you need to see a report broken down by patron status or branch location, or if you have a policy in your library that says if a patron status is blocked or barred, that they shouldn't be able to log into your electronic resources, these are all rules that can be set up using the OpenAthens service. So I can set up an if-then rule that says if a patron status stored in our Evergreen system says that somebody is blocked or barred, then they do not have access to anything, or perhaps they just don't have access to certain particular electronic resources. So again, designed specifically for libraries who may have these needs to actually identify people who have been limited in their access for one reason or another.
And just to speak to that just a little bit more, and then there's also a question that we may need to dig into offline, Wendy. But in any case, what this means for our public libraries in a practical, from a practical standpoint, and we've already worked with the Pines libraries a lot on this, and we'll continue to work with non-Pines libraries, is we know that for the first time we'll be able to, not necessarily for counter statistics and other things, but we'll be able to offer branch level statistics reporting for individual branches. And we've already talked with Chris and team about making sure that that is something as a data point that we can authenticate by and work with. So that I think is going to be a big win. And Wendy asked about setting up defaults, and I'm not quite sure, Wendy, what you mean by defaults in this context. If you could explain a bit further, you can speak up on your mic if you're able.
Good. Hi. So my thought was because you talked, Amanda, about having somebody at each library sort of in charge of such things, which I think is a great idea for customization, for ongoing sorts of things. But I wonder if there might be an opportunity to set up kind of a general default of, this is what we know to be true for public libraries.
And that's how we set things up out of the box, essentially.
I figured.
Yeah.
I just wanted
that's a
to
great
make
question,
sure.
though. Yeah, just to clarify, we sort of set things up at a everything is as it should be level. But if, for example, so Wendy and I talked a little bit about this, Amanda, and we won't spend a lot of time on this. I don't want to get us too far off track. But if, for example, and Wendy gave me a couple of examples where a library branch, rare cases, but on occasion, a library branch will license a resource just for that branch. Not very often, but it does happen. And in that case, we would work with the library to set up access so that when we have that branch level attribute that we described that we're getting statistics off of, that's something else that we can work with also to limit access just to that branch. I know that sounds convoluted and complicated, but that's something that we've talked about a little bit, and that's how we would set up. Anybody, we will be working with individual libraries, and anybody that has branch level resources, we will work to set it up so that we make sure from the get-go even that happens that way. But if we discover that or that happens after the fact, we can always do it on the fly later on as well. Does that make sense, Wendy? Everyone?
Well, it makes sense to me. I think
you do it every day. So.
Of course. So I like to put it in context too. The SWAN Consortium in Illinois is a fantastic example of how OpenAthens is typically structured for a public library system with many branches. So just give you a quick snapshot of how they set it up, and this might resonate with some of your use cases. They have a single sort of technical person or group who manages all of sort of that back-end connection, the technology and infrastructure at the top level. So they have a single administrative dashboard at the top level where, say, they connect to their Circe Dynix instance so that they can use Circe Dynix accounts and barcodes to log into the single sign-on service. And what they also do at the top level is they set up access to resources that have been purchased and are shared amongst every branch. So any technical settings for any resource access that applies to every single branch is set up at that level. However, each library has their own dashboard where, Wendy, to your point, they can go in and maybe they can pull reports specific to just their library or do some other types of administrative action that perhaps help them get more information about their library usage or customize the experience for their end users. And Russell, to your point, if there is a subscription that's purchased for a single library, maybe a library has access or a branch has access to everything that's shared, but also purchases a few databases and subscriptions outside of that just for their own branch, that can be set up, as you mentioned, at the top level. You can filter on just that branch, or it could be set up at the branch level, just in their catalog. So it can be managed in a couple of different ways. Yep. And the point really is that library hierarchies do tend to get pretty complicated when you think about where accounts are managed and the convoluted web of shared versus independent sections. And I think OpenAthens does a really nice job of providing people with whatever control they need based on what is shared or what is independent.
Yeah, and just to speak to one more piece of this, and then also to address Alyssa's comment, which is spot on as a resource and as an example of this, the as far as working with continuing to manage things at the at the system level, one of the things that we've done there is in our meetings with Pines. Is we've met with Taryn, and Taryn has given us a contact that will be, most likely be our administrator at each site. As we begin to slowly work through our sites, we'll be reaching out to those people to start the process, among others. It's generally a group process at each institution. So we have kind of done some pre-work on that, Wendy. And to Alyssa's point, thank you for this. She said, maybe correctly remembering, but the Foundation Center database is location specific. And that, I think that's the case. It may have even involved, the last I remember it, Alyssa, it was actually limited to just access by library directors. And, if we can identify those library directors with an attribute, that's something we can do to, we can control access to that. It might be a little over the top to do it for that specific resource, but we can do that. It's the type of thing that this would allow us to do. So thank you for that example.
Fantastic. Thank you, Russell. And thanks for the great questions. All right. So just to finish up on this slide, we talked about what we could provide access to for individual libraries, and that does include usage statistics. And we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into what kind of reporting OpenAthens can offer your library later in the presentation. I also want to touch on the fact that, again, going back to that concept of SAML being an industry standard in secure authentication, another benefit of using SAML authentication is that it can be used in some cases to identify misuse at the user level. And that's not to mean that the service is looking and seeing who somebody is and what they're accessing, but rather what it means is that there are built-in security protocols in the service that recognize if the same account is used, say, in Georgia and in France in the same 10-minute period, that will send up a red flag for the service. And that would be an example of something where the service may automatically suspend access and notify the administrator or the librarian listed on that branch's OpenAthens. So there are some built-in features that leverage the SAML technology that try to put a stop to misuse as soon as it's happening and notify you so you can take a look, talk to the patron, and if needed, if it's appropriate, you can re-enable access for them in your dashboard. And finally, not quite sure necessarily, I'm sure Russell, you might know how relevant this is to libraries who are here with us today, but OpenAthens, while it can connect to your Evergreen and let people log in with their Evergreen barcodes, it can also let you, as the administrator, create one-off accounts in the OpenAthens service. So, for example, if there is someone in the library, maybe a new staff member, who doesn't have an Evergreen account but needs to log into some of your electronic resources, you could create a one-off account for that person and set up an expiration date of your choosing and so on to facilitate access in the absence of an Evergreen account.
And yes, absolutely. We've talked with, and Joy mentioned earlier that we had talked through these scenarios with one of our public libraries. Well, we're still kind of in a holding pattern with Atlanta Fulton Public Library. They've been ready to go live for some time, but there's a technical issue that we're waiting for the IT department at the City of Atlanta to resolve. But in any case, that is one of the scenarios that we talked about a lot with guest users. It's really easy to set up and manage guest users using a couple of different options in OpenAthens. There's some scenarios I'm sure where this could be applicable for public libraries, and it's something that we have actually been offering training on routinely lately, and we will continue to offer training on setting up guest users in various ways.
Perfect. All right. So now that we've talked about what generally can be expected to change both for patrons and for librarians and administrators, we want to touch on a few details specific to Galileo public libraries. So as we've already mentioned, patrons will be using their Evergreen ILS accounts for logins. So it'll be the same account that they're already accustomed to using for likely a number of other things within your library. And again, as we already mentioned, there are probably some different data attributes and data points that are stored in Evergreen that could be used for usage reporting or for assigning permissions. And I I think that amongst the public libraries I've worked with so far, the patron status example is absolutely the most common, as well as the branch example. When there are many branches in play, it's very helpful to break down usage for a shared resource by branch to see where the most usage is coming from, just a little bit more insight into what's going on. However, as was brought up before, if there are certain people who should have access to a platform or a publisher, we can even set the permissions down to that level. So it doesn't have to be on a patron status or branch. It can actually be for specific people or groups that are configured in some other way. So as long as the data is available and we can create an if-then rule in OpenAthens, then the sky is pretty much the limit. And once you get started working with Russell and his team, if you have specific needs for permissions and group identification for reporting, they will be able to help you understand what is available, what is possible based on the data that's stored in Evergreen about those users.
Yeah, and just to kind of make a comment on that in terms of what attributes we will have available to us. That's a pending meeting that I have talked with Chris Sharp at Pines and with gosh, my names are slipping away. Whitney Payne at GPLS, and I will sit down and talk about this from a reporting perspective, especially, and work through, what patron attributes we want to come into the system. And those attributes are all, they're all encrypted. There's nothing that's available to the outside. You can't really correlate a user to the attributes passed, but we do get a lot of good information that can be used for reporting purposes.
Fantastic. So, and I'm sure once those that attribute schema is nailed down, Russell, that'll be documented at the OpenAthens implementation book guide.
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So something that's important, and maybe something that you were asking yourself when we started talking about Evergreen, is simply that other Evergreen operations and workflows will not change as a result of using Evergreen accounts to log into OpenAthens. So whatever other library operations occur in the Evergreen application will not change.
And just a good timing with mentioning this, as you're going to be talking, you can go ahead. I mean, just as you're talking about implementation, we spent a lot of time talking about Evergreen, and that will be the primary implementation. But do note that we are working with EBSCO to develop connectors with other systems. There is already an existing CERSI connector for those that are on CERSI. We're a little bit challenged by Gwinnett, but Amanda and I have scheduled a conversation at some point in the not too distant future as Gwinnett is transitioning to an OCLC-based system to figure out, what types of things are happening there from an OCLC authentication perspective that we can build on. I know there are TLC libraries and other library systems that we may need to connect to, but EBSCO has made the commitment to creating connectors so that we can connect to those systems and use those systems for identity management.
That is correct. Yep. And I think we recently, or maybe not too long ago, we did an assessment of any library branches who use something outside of Evergreen. If my memory serves, the conclusion was that the OCLC instance was the only one that brought up any questions, and everything else was potentially compatible.
That is correct.
All right, so now we want to jump into the implementation process that public libraries can expect to navigate. And again, this will be a very high-level overview of the step-by-step. The idea walking through this now is ahead of your OpenAthens implementation to give you an idea of what information we might need from your library branch and at what time during the implementation we will need it. So if you know, for example, that gathering information about the subscription specific to your branch will require the help of certain staff members, then ahead of time you have an idea of when to engage those people. So we'll start first by talking about who will actually be helping you navigate the OpenAthens implementation. And so for all matters OpenAthens related, Russell Palmer and his extended team will be your primary point of contact. As Russell mentioned, the main portion, one of the cornerstones of implementing OpenAthens for public libraries will be connecting to Evergreen for many branches, but for other branches who don't use Evergreen, connecting to whatever ILS that you have in use at this time for logins. So that will likely be one of the first things that we start talking about, and Russell's team have been fantastic in working with our team here at EBSCO throughout to make sure that those technical components are set up and working correctly. It will likely, probably won't be very common that you'll talk directly with EBSCO's implementation team, but just to give you an idea of who we have working on this over here at EBSCO, we do have an OpenAthens implementation specialist. His name is Pete Hine. He's been with our software implementation team for, I think, almost 20 years at this point. I don't even know the exact number, but he's been with our team since well before OpenAthens even became a thing for Galileo. So he is well-versed, he's an expert, and he takes care of all the technical components over here. And then we're helped also by Wayne Mackey, who is a project manager for implementations here at EBSCO. And Wayne is a dedicated project manager for Galileo specifically. So there's a dedicated team for the Galileo OpenAthens implementation over here at EBSCO. And then behind EBSCO, any enhancements, any tickets that need to be resolved by fixed in the product itself, we forward on to OpenAthens team. So OpenAthens as a service is not owned by EBSCO, but we have a very close partnership with the team in the UK who develops and manages that piece of software.
And just as a point of clarification here, once your implementation begins, you will likely at some point meet Pete and Wayne in some circumstance or the other on an online meeting or what have you. But generally, anything that is support related, all of that will be channeled through Galileo Support by using our Contact Us form. We will work with you and bring them to the table whenever needed. You can pretty much rely on our team to route and get answers to any questions that are outstanding about your implementation at the time. And I would like to speak to the dedication of Pete and Wayne. They have both visited us multiple times here in Athens. They've done multiple site visits. They actually went to a Georgia football game. They were so excited to do that. So they have been on the ground here with us. They've done a lot of work with us. They came down. We did a lot of planning for the public libraries implementation here in state. So they have been super dedicated to the project and really helpful throughout.
All right. So when you begin the OpenAthens implementation process, there is typically some information gathering that is needed. However, for the technical components like connecting to Evergreen for logins, those details will have been provided and configured between Russell Palmer and his team and our team here at EBSCO. So ahead of time, there is really not too much that needs to be gathered on the branch side outside of any information about library subscriptions that are specific to your branch. And we'll talk a little bit more about what details we ask libraries to gather in a moment. You'll notice too, as we go through these slides, when you do get these, the slide deck, you will have a link to Galileo's onboarding LibGuide. You may already have that bookmarked. It's a fantastic resource. So if you don't already, I would recommend visiting it, bookmarking it for your reference in the future. It has helpful documentation, links to trainings that we've given previously, and lots of lessons learned from libraries who've already implemented OpenAthens.
Just to second that, we spent a lot of time working on the documentation and we recorded all there. And we have Natalie on our team who is very dedicated to making sure that the training piece of it stays up to date as we do new training sessions and information sessions.
All right. So some of the work that happens during the OpenAthens implementation, and that I'll cover here, is actually happening quite behind the scenes, either by our team or by Russell's team. So once we know which subscriptions need to be set up to use the OpenAthens service, we will want to make sure that your on-site IPs are registered, and any providers who support SAML access will be contacted and set up by our team here at EBSCO.
Just to offer a little bit more detail on this, you pretty much all ignore the technical language about the OpenAthens forward proxy. What we will do is we will send you a list of resources that need to have a single IP address added We will give you that IP address and the list of vendors and ask you to contact them. And it should be a fairly short list in most cases for public libraries, but that is just one step where we will need your help. And then also just to add to that workflow, one of the things that I've done it with about 3 additional libraries in addition to Atlanta Fulton Public now is one of the things that we collect very early on in the process is we need just to get a list of all of your non-Galileo, anything that's that Galileo core, that GPLS core, we know about and we'll take care of. But anything that you're purchasing out of your own library budget, any resources that you buy in addition to the Galileo resources, we'll just need to know about those, and we have some specific information that we ask for from those so that we can begin that setup process with EBSCO reaching out to the vendors and setting up that federated or SAML or OpenAthens access for you. So we take care of all of that on both the Galileo side and the EBSCO side. We just ask you to make a list once we check it and get it working, and then we'll give you a list back of a few more things that you need to do in terms of reaching out to vendors.
All right. So once vendors are contacted, we typically ask the libraries that we're working with to do some what we call pre-launch testing. So OpenAthens is a very link-based service. What that means is launching OpenAthens actually just involves updating links to your electronic resources and content to use a piece of OpenAthens information. And so prior to launching OpenAthens for your library or updating links wherever they live, we'll ask you just to test logging in using some sample links of vendor content that we've already set up to use OpenAthens, and just confirm that everything looks like it should, that we're referencing your Evergreen or other ILS accounts, and that you're able to successfully log in and access the full text that your library subscribes to.
This is where it gets fun. It's amazing when you see it for the first time. We'll give you a link that has a prefix on it for a database, or we'll give you a little tiny piece to add to your Galileo Express links as a suffix, and it works, and it's amazing. And you didn't have to do much to make it work. But credit to the EBSCO team who does a lot of really good work to make that happen. Also, just to speak to the pre-launch testing, we test everything really fully. We'll have a list of all your resources, including your Galileo and non-Galileo. We set all that up in your Galileo portal so that all the right links are there. You don't have to worry about touching the Galileo portal. For those of you who may work in GLRI to do that, we do all of that for you. So we test about 3 times on our end before we actually formally activate OpenAthens for you. And we encourage you to help out with that testing, and we provide you with a list of resources that you can use to do that with as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Russell. All right. So following pre-launch testing, when everything has been confirmed to be working as needed, Galileo and member sites will decide when to launch OpenAthens. And again, launching really just means updating any links that your patrons are clicking on to use whatever syntax is needed, that little piece at the end for your Galileo quick links, or the prefix on the beginning for other links. And our teams really do everything we can to make this process as smooth and undisrupted to access as possible. And so, for example, if your library uses EBSCO Host or EBSCO Discovery Service, any of our EBSCO platform that has permalinks, links to other vendor content, going out to other publishers, those are all things that our team can help update. So your library won't be required to do all of that work, check all of those links off. And beyond that, for any non-EBSCO platforms, so use Alma, if you're accessing via the Galileo portal, those places are all covered by Galileo's team. So we've become a pretty well-oiled machine at this point, I think. And again, we really try to make this process as smooth and undisruptive as possible for your library.
And also, just to invoke the LibGuide again, we have a very well done, Ken Hensley worked with Cat Hart at Georgia State early on. in the process to create a linking guide and that linking guide describes any and all the different types of links that you might have to use, but it's pretty consistent. And there are also link generators that we can offer. We won't dig into the weeds with that technical aspect of it, but we make it, I think Amanda described it well. We work to make this as easy as possible and to help as much as possible. If you have a long list or a spreadsheet full of links that we can work with, we can transform those links into OpenAthens links in no time flat. It takes us a minute just to get the time because we're always doing that, but we become, as Amanda mentioned, really efficient at updating links.
All right. Once all of that is completed, then the fun part, as Russell called it, is launching OpenAthens, really seeing how much more efficient that makes library access, especially if your users are remote. So on the agreed upon date, if there's a particular date or time period that you feel it's most appropriate to launch, maybe it's a time period or a week where you know that you'll have all of the relevant staff in the library or on deck to help with anything, we can launch whenever you need. So on the agreed upon date, we'll update all of the links in all of those different places, and your users will begin accessing your electronic content using OpenAthens.
And go live dates are pretty seamless. We do a lot of testing on that date as well. Amanda had mentioned earlier, you all use the Galileo Discover search, whether you have that deployed on your library website or your patrons use it through Galileo itself. That's the one major thing that changes, and we do a lot of post-launch testing once that script that Amanda mentioned has run that updates the EBSCO links. It generally works well. It won't be absolutely perfect on day one, but generally by day two, we have everything working very seamlessly, working very well. And the other nice thing is whether you have your own easy proxy or you're relying on the Galileo easy proxy for authentication, that is still there as a backup. And we encourage our libraries to leave their easy proxy in place. And obviously we're going to leave ours in place for some time to come. But that way you have that backup. So if someone hit the link that still routes through the proxy, they'll still be able to get access to the resource. We've done a lot of planning and thought about this. Particularly Brad Baxter was really instrumental in working on this early on in this process to make sure that there was as little disruption of service as possible in this transition.
All right. So, and then following launch, there is a period of what we call user acceptance testing, really just that period of time where as people begin using OpenAthens to access your electronic resources, if any oddities come up, any questions, you need help deploying additional links, so on and so forth, our team remains in play and involved to help resolve those as quickly as possible.
To describe how this looks in real time is generally on the day or two surrounding Glow Live. Glow Live, that'd be a whole different type of thing, wouldn't it, Amanda? Go Live. You're generally in direct communication with Ken, Mike, and myself regarding any issues. We may drift back into using our support system, but generally we email with you directly during this process. We're super responsive. We're generally on Slack, which is a communications platform, a chat platform with Wayne and Pete during the 2 days or so after an institution goes live, correcting problems, reporting problems really quickly, and getting them resolved really quickly. And generally, it sorts itself out very quickly. We've, again, going back to the efficiency that Amanda pointed to, we've gotten really very good at this time.
All right. So this is the further detail that I mentioned earlier about what libraries can do to prepare, what information may be needed from your library during your OpenAthens setup if you have subscriptions outside of what's shared and will be set up for everyone. So these are instructions that Russell helped us put together. I think this might be important to know if libraries are imminently embarking on their OpenAthens setup. We'll need you to verify a list of any locally purchased electronic resources. Galileo's team outside of that will pull from GLRI and provide that to your library so you can confirm that it is full and accurate and complete. If anything's missing or out of date, we'll just need you to update that list so we have an accurate and full list of your subscriptions up front because that is the information that our teams will be using to reach out to vendors and set up access for.
And I plan to start generating these lists and making contacts fairly soon in the next week or so. Our timing is starting to get good for that on our end. We're not in a huge hurry here, but we do want to get these implementations underway.
All right, perfect. So here's again, the sort of 10,000-foot view of what to expect on what we call Go Live Day when you launch OpenAthens for your library branch. And this is just a more detailed breakdown of who updates what links. And to Russell's point, to date, minimal issues have really arisen post Go Live. I think everybody is just sort of on deck and ready to resolve any errors or issues during that time. If I'm not mistaken, Russell, I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong, but when we schedule Go Live date for any particular library or library branch, we never schedule more than one library on the same day. We want a dedicated day for rolling that out for each individual branch. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. We'll schedule one system at a time. And we also never schedule on Mondays because Mondays are horrible, and we never schedule on Fridays because we don't want to have problems going into the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Good point. All right. Following Go Live, when your library has OpenAthens up and running, people are using it to log in. We'll just want to make sure that any other areas outside of the EBSCO platform or the Galileo portal and so on have been identified where links live, essentially. If your library uses, say, ebook links in your ILS MARC records, or if you have other areas of your web page where links might need to be updated, then those areas will have been identified earlier in the implementation, and any guidance that you need in updating links in those areas to sort of complete your full Go Live, you will have received from the Galileo team.
Yep, that all sounds consistent with what we do.
Perfect. Yep. Now I'm pausing in between every slide, Russell. So
yeah, I could feel it. So I was like, Amanda and I have done presentations together probably 25 times now, so we're getting used to it.
Yep, absolutely. It's actually been a little longer than usual, so I feel a little rusty.
No, we're out of sync a little bit.
All right, so one of the big questions we might get if your library is using Evergreen or some other type of ILS account or barcode to log into the single sign-on service is, what happens if somebody doesn't have a library card? My understanding, based on conversations with Russell, is that this is going to be sort of a minority use case. It's not going to happen as much. Usually people who have been to the library or accessing your electronic resources will already have had a library card that they can log in with. That said, I'll defer to you, Russell, for any further information.
I just want to add quickly, and I apologize I didn't notice this earlier, but the geolocation will go away with the new Galileo that will be launched on July 21st. For a variety of reasons, security reasons, licensing reasons, and other things, that geolocation feature will no longer be continued in Galileo 2021, or Galileo Search as we're calling it now, just to be clear about that. But you're absolutely right. There are situations where someone doesn't have a library card. I know that several systems, including Athens, have deployed like extra robust self-registration systems during COVID-19 crisis. And we will do as a phase 2 of this. We're starting to look at this, and we haven't looked at it in depth in a while. But one of the things that we would like to do is OpenAthens does have an add-on for a self-registration service that is of high appeal, where we could have them set up to access resources at a basic level. We can create an OpenAthens profile, and this is more technical detail than you need, but we could have them set up to, say, for example, access just the Galileo core public library resources, not the local resources, for a short period of time, while they're waiting to set up their public library card as part of the self-registration process. So there's a lot of workflow and detail that we would need to work on with Pines with that, but that is something that we have thought about, considered, and is a possibility for the future.
All right, so I will update this slide before we make it available to attendees later on. Sorry about that, Russell.
No, you sent your slides ahead of time and I just overlooked it.
All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about what the implementation process will look like and what is needed and expected of member libraries, I want to touch on what types of reporting is available in OpenAthens. And if I'm not mistaken, there is some documentation linked to from the Galileo OpenAthens implementation LibGuide that goes into a little bit more detail. And we here at EBSCO have created documentation along those lines as well, just what types of reporting and statistics libraries can expect to have access to when their library is up and running on OpenAthens. And so to give you just a really quick breakdown, OpenAthens reports by default will report on how many logins have occurred, and that can be broken down by a particular publisher or vendor platform, which tends to be a popular report. And it can also be broken down by user group or permission set. So for example, going back to the patron status example or the library branch example, if this is a shared resource that people are logging into and we want to see how much usage is coming in from each library branch, or perhaps how much usage is coming from a particular patron status group, that is something that if set up, and again, Russell, I'll defer to you. I know that you're still nailing down what those data attributes coming from Evergreen will look like, but if it's set up, then you will be able to see a report broken down by that data.
The big one is branch, and we know that we want to do that, and we know that GPLS has a commitment to doing that.
All right. And here we go. We have that example here, break down a report by any data attribute that's coming through from the data source, in this case, Evergreen. There are some libraries and typically I think usually they're school or academic libraries who have a mandate to compare user level usage with academic outcomes. OpenAthens by default does not track individual users. Unless it's specifically customized and set up to do so, your reports will not reflect individual user usage. And that does tend to be the preference amongst almost all, if not all, of the public libraries we work with, simply to protect patron privacy. So suffice to say, if that was a question in mind, the OpenAthens service does not track user level usage unless it is specifically needed and requested by your library. I do also want to point out that on the roadmap, there is some development in queue by the OpenAthens team to make OpenAthens reporting surfaceable in other types of data applications. So if your library uses something like Google Analytics or Tableau to manage your statistics, this API that they're making available will allow your OpenAthens statistics to be surfaced in those applications as well. Oh, go on.
I just want to point out, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that if you don't use an application like that, that's completely fine. But I like this example because I think that the use of reports have become really important to the libraries that we work with in many different ways. And so this is a good example of how OpenAthens listens to the feedback we receive from libraries and is adding enhancements to the product to meet their needs.
I just, you actually, sorry, I should have let you go because you segued right into my comment, which was one of the things that we asked for very early on that has been actioned now by OpenAthens that we have access to is consortial level reporting. So Wendy, for the GPS level reporting, we're actually working with USG, TCSG already to get them consortial level reporting. And we're working on ways to add that to the Galileo statistics reports so that anyone that wanted it could have access to the consortial level access report from OpenAthens. So that's something that I think is really valuable. TCSG has already started to look at them with great interest. So we look forward to sharing that as well. Thanks, Amanda.
Absolutely. So final slide before we open the floor for any additional questions that have come to mind. Just again, a reminder that there's lots of really valuable documentation and resources and examples in this slide deck. So when they become available, if there are any colleagues within your library branch who weren't able to attend, and this is information you'd like to share with them so they also have an idea of what to expect when they might be involved. These slides have lots of supporting documentation to expand the picture for you. And so on that note, with 6 minutes left in the hour, I will open the floor. If there are any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm sure between Russell and myself, we can give you an answer that paints the picture for you.
And just quickly, as a final comment, I did want to offer a clarification. The initial setup that we'll do will be at the branch level. I told Wendy we're playing it fast and loose with branch versus system. So in Georgia, it's system, then branch is sort of the workflow. And I know, Amanda, it can be different in different places. And I know Swan may be different. And I know that's the most common example we use. But yeah, absolutely. We'll be primarily setting up at the system level. So Atlanta, Fulton County, for example. So just to make that clarification, and please, any questions that you have, if you have a microphone, if you want to type your question in the chat, we'll be more than happy to answer. Or if a question occurs to you after the fact, Joy will make sure that you have our contact information.
Hi, everyone. It's Joy. Yes, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it aloud. We'll give that, a little bit of time here and see if anything comes up.
It's 3 o'clock on Friday, no questions. You can ask all you want, I'm just joking.
Okay, well, seeing none come in, I want to thank Amanda and Russell for this very informative presentation. As well, I'd like to thank you all. See how many of you guys are left. I think it's 23 of you guys, including us, who are left.
Dedication on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. This is the last presentation in the series for the Galileo Virtual Conference, and we really appreciate you all hanging with us to the very end. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our presenters, and we will hopefully y'all have a great weekend.
You too, Joy. You too, everyone. Thanks again, Amanda. Everybody take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.